They say dignity has no price. But that afternoon I learned that humiliation has a cost, and I was about to collect every single cent of it, with interest. My name is Soila. I am 72 years old, and by that age I had already survived a bitter divorce, the lonely raising of a son, and the building of a small food empire out of nothing but flour, fire, and stubbornness. I thought life had run out of bitter surprises for me. I thought I had earned the right to rest on the laurels of everything I had built. I was wrong. So wrong that it would nearly break me before it set me free. That Saturday, the sun fell heavy over the garden where the wedding was being held. But the cold I felt in my chest when my daughter-in-law dragged me into the shadows was colder than any winter I had ever lived through alone. That day was supposed to be the happiest day of Esteban's life. My grandson, my adoration, the boy who used to cling to my flour-dusted skirts when he was small. I had promised him back then that when he got married his grandmother would give him the most spectacular wedding in the world. And I kept that promise. I kept it with everything I had. Years of savings. The money from selling my old delivery van. The last of my retirement fund. All of it went into that banquet. Signing those checks didn't hurt me. I did it with the blind love that only a grandmother understands. But blind love sometimes stops us from seeing the snakes crawling right beside us. I woke early that morning. The house was silent, the way it had been silent for more than 30 years, ever since I separated from my husband. I had learned to love that silence, to fill it with radio music and the smell of fresh coffee. I never needed a man beside me to feel whole. My business and my family had been my compass, my North Star, the two things I built my whole life around. I walked to my closet and pulled out the garment bag holding my treasure. A raw silk suit, champagne-colored, with mother-of-pearl buttons and a classic cut that I believed would never go out of style. I had bought it exactly 20 years earlier, for my son Roberto's university graduation. I remembered exactly how hard it was to pay for it back then, sewing extra hours at night, selling hundreds of empanadas out of my kitchen window just to afford that one beautiful thing. That suit wasn't only fabric. It was a symbol of everything I had survived, everything I had provided in the middle of scarcity. I had cared for it like a relic, hand-washed, wrapped in tissue paper so the humidity would never touch it. When I put it on in front of my bedroom mirror, time seemed to stop. The silk settled onto my body, a body that no longer had the firmness of youth but still carried the upright posture of a woman who had carried heavy weight without ever bending. I smoothed the skirt, pinned on a silver brooch that had belonged to my mother, and I felt like a queen ready to watch her prince be crowned. I arrived at the venue by taxi. The place was breathtaking, an enormous garden with white tents, flower arrangements that cost a fortune, and a string orchestra tuning their instruments. All of it I had paid for. Every flower, every chair, every fine crystal glass. Roberto, my son, had thanked me with a quick hug weeks earlier, always with that evasive look he got whenever his wife Lorena was nearby. Lorena, a woman in her 40s obsessed with social media and the appearance of a perfect family that existed only in her head and in the filtered photos she posted online. We had never gotten along. But out of love for my son and my grandson, I had learned to bite my tongue. I kept a careful distance, a cold diplomacy. That day, that diplomacy was about to shatter into 1,000 pieces. I walked into the garden with a wide smile, searching for Esteban. I wanted to see him before the ceremony, to bless him, to tell him how proud I was. Guests were beginning to arrive, young friends of the couple, a few distant relatives. I walked with a firm step, feeling the soft rustle of silk against my legs. I felt elegant, appropriate, a respectable matriarch. Then a hand grabbed my arm. Hard, almost violent. I turned and found myself staring into Lorena's eyes. She wore a blood-red dress, far too tight, and makeup that tried to hide the lines bitterness had carved into her face. She didn't smile. Her eyes traveled down my body, stopping with open contempt on my champagne-colored suit, on my comfortable low-heeled shoes, on my old silver brooch. "Lorena," I asked, confused by her grip. "What's wrong? Where's?" She didn't answer right away. She glanced around, making sure no one important was watching, and then she dragged me, literally dragged me, into a corner hidden behind a column wrapped in ivy, far from the entrance where the photographer was capturing the guests arriving. "What exactly are you wearing, Soila?" she hissed. Her whisper was like the hiss of a snake. "What is that?" "A costume from some 90s horror movie." I felt as if I'd been slapped. My hand went instinctively to the mother-of-pearl buttons on my jacket. "It's my silk suit," I answered, trying to keep my voice steady even though my heart was racing. "It's a fine suit, Lorena. I wore it to Roberto's graduation." "Exactly. 20 years ago." Her eyes went wide with disgust. "It smells old, Soila. It smells like mothballs and poverty." "It doesn't smell like anything," I defended myself, feeling heat rush to my cheeks. "I had it dry cleaned last week. It's pure silk, not some rag." "It's a rag for this wedding," she said, leaning her face into mine. I could smell her expensive, sickly sweet perfume. "Listen to me carefully. This wedding is going to be all over Instagram. My friends, the club women, Roberto's business partners, everyone is going to see those photos. I cannot let you, looking like some woman frozen in time, ruin the aesthetic I worked so hard to plan." "The aesthetic you worked so hard to plan," I repeated, feeling a jolt of disbelief. "Lorena, I paid for this aesthetic. I paid for the flowers, the music, the food." "Money doesn't buy good taste," she snapped, jabbing her finger into my shoulder. "And you are living proof. Look at that color. It makes you look dead. And that brooch, my God, it looks like it came from a garage sale." I looked toward the main hall. In the distance I could see Roberto, my son, greeting guests, laughing with a glass in his hand. I wanted to scream, to call him over, to beg him to put his wife in her place. But something stopped me, an old habit of never causing a scene, of never ruining my grandson's moment. Roberto had never defended me. Since marrying her, he had become a small man, a satellite orbiting around Lorena's every whim. If I called him, he would probably lower his head and ask me to be understanding, to remember she was just nervous about the wedding. "I want to see my grandson," I said, trying to step around her. Lorena blocked my path with her body. "Don't even think about it," she said, and this time her voice was a military order. "Esteban is busy, and I am not letting you stand next to him at the altar in that outfit. You'll ruin the official photos. Those photos last forever, Soila. Do you want your grandson embarrassed every time he opens his wedding album and sees his grandmother dressed like a beggar?" The word beggar echoed in my head. I, who had worked 18 hours a day for years so they would never lack anything. I, who had lent them money for their house down payment. Money they never returned. I, who was paying for the luxury banquet that would be served in a few hours. "What do you want me to do then?" I asked, my voice cracking, dignity fighting against the tears threatening to fall. Lorena pointed to a side service door, a swinging metal door where the waiters came and went with their trays. "Go to the kitchen," she said without a shred of remorse. "Stay there. The cooks know you, don't they? After all, that's where you come from. You'll feel right at home, among the pots and the grease. When the party starts, I'll find you some dark corner at a back table where you won't show up in the videos. But during the ceremony and the official photos, I want you invisible. Understood? Invisible." I stood there, paralyzed. The pain was physical. A sharp ache in the center of my chest, as if my heart had been ripped out and stomped under her stiletto heels. I looked down at my dress. Suddenly it no longer looked elegant to me. Her words had made me see stains where there were none, made me feel that the silk had turned to burlap. I felt small, old, useless. "Mama, please, don't make me call security," Lorena added, seeing that I hadn't moved. "It would embarrass Esteban. Do it for him. For him." They always used Esteban as a shield. They knew my love for that boy was my weak point. "Fine," I whispered. My voice sounded foreign, distant. "Good girl," she said with a triumphant smile that chilled my blood. She patted my arm condescendingly, the way you'd pat an obedient dog. Now go, and don't come out until I say so. I turned around. My legs trembled as I walked toward the service door. I felt the eyes of a few arriving guests on me, but I didn't dare look up. Shame burned my face. I pushed through the swinging door, and the elegant noise of the garden faded, replaced by the clatter of dishes, shouted orders, and the thick smell of spices and roasting meat. The kitchen was organized chaos. At least 20 people running back and forth. The heat was suffocating, a brutal contrast to the cool breeze outside. I pressed myself against the wall, trying not to be in the way. Dona Soila, a deep voice called out. It was Jacinto, the head waiter, a man I had worked with years ago when I still ran my own catering business. He knew my story. He looked at me, eyes wide, taking in my party dress in the middle of that industrial rush. Dona Soila, what are you doing here? He asked, wiping his hands on his apron. You should be out there, at the head table. Today is your grandson's wedding. I couldn't answer. The knot in my throat was too big to let me breathe. Jacinto saw my face, saw my glassy eyes, and understood that something terrible had happened. With a gentleness I didn't expect, he brought me a plastic chair. Sit for a moment, Dona. I'll bring you a glass of water. I let myself fall into the chair. From where I sat, I could see through the small round window in the swinging door. I saw Lorena laughing, adjusting the bride's veil, posing for the cameras. I saw my son Roberto pouring himself another glass, completely unaware that his mother had just been exiled like some kind of outcast. And I thought about Esteban. Did he know what was happening? Or was he ashamed of me too? I looked down at my dress again. I touched the silk. I remembered the day I bought it. I remembered the triumph of watching my son graduate. I remembered every sacrifice. Your rags will ruin the photos, she had said. Go to the kitchen, that's where you come from. Yes. That's exactly where I came from. From the kitchen. From hard work, from fire and effort. Lorena thought that was an insult. But in that moment, surrounded by steam and hard-working people, I realized something. The kitchen wasn't my shame. It was my kingdom. And in my kingdom, I had all the power. The pain began to transform. That thick, heavy sadness began to boil into something more volatile. More dangerous. Indignation. A cold, calculating fury took hold of me. She had humiliated me. She had hidden me. She had treated me like a servant at the very party I had financed myself. I remembered the catering contract. I had signed it myself. The check came out of my account. The owner of the catering company, Mr. Ferrero, was an old friend and colleague. He answered only to whoever paid the bill. I looked up. Jacinto was watching me with concern. Are you all right, Dona Soila? He asked again. I took a deep breath. The smell of filet mignon in mushroom sauce filled the air, the most expensive dish on the menu. Lorena had insisted on it, saying chicken was for common people. Jacinto, I said. My voice no longer trembled. It sounded dry, hard, like stone. Lend me your phone, please. I left mine in my purse and I don't want to go looking for it. Of course, Dona. He handed me the phone. My fingers dialed the number of the catering company's main office, a number I knew by heart. While the line rang, I looked once more through the little window. Lorena was toasting with champagne, looking so sure of herself, so untouchable. She thought she had beaten me, that I would sit there crying in a corner among the dirty pots until she decided it was time to bring me back out. Ferrero Catering, I said when they answered. This is Soila. Put me through to the manager immediately. It's an emergency. There was a pause, then Ferrero's voice. Soila, what a pleasure. How's everything going over there? I hear the setup looks beautiful. Listen to me carefully, Ricardo. I cut him off with no time for pleasantries. I felt adrenaline flood my veins, erasing the exhaustion and the years. I need you to give an order to your team right now, at my grandson's wedding. Of course, whatever you need. Running low on ice? More wine? No, I said, watching the waiters preparing trays of appetizers. I want you to stop everything. Stop what? I don't understand. Stop the service, Ricardo. Absolutely everything. No waiter carries out one more glass, not one more canopy. And tell the head chef to shut off the ovens. Soiler, are you feeling all right? His voice sounded alarmed. The reception is about to start. If we stop now, the food will spoil. The guests. I know exactly what will happen, I answered, and a bitter, almost cruel smile spread across my lips. But it turns out, according to my daughter-in-law, my presence and my money smell like poverty. So I've decided to take my poverty somewhere else. And that includes the banquet I paid for. Soiler, this is a huge contract. It's my contract, Ricardo. And if one more plate leaves that kitchen without my authorization, I will sue your company for breach of contract. I paid. I give the orders. Are we clear? There was silence on the other end, then a resigned sigh. You're in charge, Soiler. I'll call the head waiter right now. I hung up and handed the phone back to Jacinto. He was looking at me with a mix of terror and admiration. Donna, what did you just do? I stood up. I smoothed my champagne silk dress. It no longer felt like an old rag to me. Now it felt like armor. What I should have done a long time ago, Jacinto, I said, walking toward the back exit of the kitchen, away from the party, away from the humiliation. I just taught them not to bite the hand that feeds them. I stepped outside through the back of the venue. I wasn't going to stay and watch the opening spectacle. I didn't need to see it. I knew exactly what was going to happen when the 200 elegant guests sat down at their tables and the plates never came. I felt strangely light, as if 20 years had lifted off my shoulders. The tear that had been threatening to fall dried up before it ever touched my cheek. The war had begun, and Lorena had just made the mistake of her life, underestimating the woman who built an empire with an oven and 2 hands. The taxi ride home was, paradoxically, one of the calmest moments I had lived in years. As the car pulled away from the venue, leaving behind the string music and the murmur of false smiles, I felt the air return fully to my lungs. The driver, an older man with a graying mustache, glanced at me in the rearview mirror a few times, probably wondering why a woman dressed for a gala was leaving a party at 2 in the afternoon with dry eyes and a clenched jaw. He didn't ask, and I silently thanked him for it. When I got to my house, that small brick fortress covered in vines that I had built with so much sacrifice, I paid the fare and walked in with my head held high. No one was watching. The street was empty. But dignity isn't a performance for an audience. It's a posture toward life itself. I opened the gate, walked up the stone path, and stepped into my sanctuary. The smell of floor wax and lavender welcomed me like an old embrace. No daughters-in-law looking at me with disgust in there. No sons lowering their heads out of cowardice. In there, I was simply Soiler, master of my own destiny. I took off my shoes at the door. My feet, swollen from stress and hard soles, thanked me for the cold contact with the wooden floor. I walked to my bedroom but didn't take off the dress. I stood in front of the full-length mirror, the same mirror that hours earlier had shown me the reflection of a hopeful grandmother. Now it showed me the reflection of a wounded woman. Wounded, yes, but not defeated. I touched the champagne silk. Lorena had been right about one thing. This dress carried history. But it wasn't a history of poverty. It was a history of war. And I had just walked into a new battle. That initial sadness, the one that had bent me over in the kitchen of the venue, had completely evaporated. In its place was a cold, clinical, analytical emptiness. For years I had operated on the logic of the heart. Forgiving Lorena's cruelty just to see my grandchildren. Lending Roberto money without asking for receipts so he wouldn't feel less of a man. Paying for luxuries that weren't mine to pay for, just to buy a little family peace. It's over, I said out loud. My voice echoed off the walls of the empty room. I went to the kitchen, poured myself a glass of red wine from a bottle I kept for special occasions, and walked to my study. It was a small room at the back of the house, where I still kept the old oak desk from which I had run my catering business for decades. My ledgers were there, my invoices, and a grey metal safe built into the wall, hidden behind a painting of Andean landscapes. I sat in the leather swivel chair, which creaked under my weight like an old friend greeting me. I took a long sip of wine and began to think. I needed to understand the full weight of my own foolishness. I needed to see, in black and white, how much it had cost me to keep up the fiction that we were a united family. I turned the safe dial. Right, left, right. The metallic click sounded like a judge's gavel. The heavy door opened, revealing the archive of my life. Deeds, insurance policies, and at the back, a thick, dark blue accordion folder labeled simply with the name Roberto. I pulled it out and set it on the desk. Dust danced in the beam of light coming through the window. When I opened it, the smell of old paper hit me. I began pulling out documents, one by one. First, Roberto's university receipts, paid in full. Then the invoices for the car I gifted him when he got married. And then I reached the section my mind, in an act of self-protection, had decided to forget or minimize over the past decade. There was a notarized document dated 12 years earlier. I remembered that day with painful clarity. Roberto had come to see me in tears, telling me his import business was failing and the bank was about to foreclose on his house. Lorena had been pregnant with Esteban at the time. They had begged me for help. I, of course, could not allow my grandson to be born without a safe roof over his head. I had given them my life savings at that moment, a considerable sum I had planned to use to travel through Europe, a dream from my youth. But I hadn't simply given it to them. My lawyer at the time, a distrustful, wise man named Don Anselmo, had insisted that they sign a document. Soila, money corrupts, and memory is short, he had told me. Have them sign this. Not as a punishment. As insurance. I unfolded the paper. It was a debt acknowledgement secured by a mortgage. In simple terms, I had lent them the money to save their house, but in exchange, the property stood as collateral in my favor. If they failed to repay me within the agreed period, which had expired 5 years ago, I had the legal right to enforce the guarantee. Worse still for them, the document stated that in the event of non-payment, 60% ownership of the property would pass automatically into my name, through a direct assignment clause they had signed without reading, desperate for the money. My eyes traveled down to the signatures at the bottom of the page. Roberto's, shaky, and Lorena's, with those large, arrogant strokes she used to make. She had signed her own sentence 12 years ago and didn't even remember it. I kept searching. I found another, more recent paper. It was the wedding contract. I read it carefully, looking for the fine print. I was listed as the primary client and sole payer. There was a clause, number 14, about service cancellation. It read clearly, the primary client reserves the right to cancel or suspend the service at any time if they believe the conditions of the event fail to meet their standards, assuming the cost of what has already been prepared, but without additional penalty for the interruption of ongoing service. I smiled. Not a smile of joy, the kind of smile wolves make when they've cornered their prey. Legally, my call to Ricardo Ferrero hadn't been the whim of a crazy old woman. It had been the exercise of a contractual right. Lorena could scream all she wanted, but the law was on my side. The landline on my desk began to ring, pulling me out of my thoughts. I looked at the caller ID. It was Ricardo's cell. I let it ring 3 times before answering. I wanted to steady myself. I wanted my voice to sound like the matriarch who owned everything, not the wounded grandmother. Talk to me, Ricardo, I answered, skipping the greeting. Soila, this is a madhouse. His voice was agitated, and in the background I could hear a growing murmur, like the buzz of an angry swarm. I did what you asked. I stopped everything. The waiters pulled the glasses back. The kitchen shut off the burners. We're packing up. And the reaction? I asked, leaning back in the chair and turning the mortgage document between my fingers. Lorena's hysterical. She's screaming at my staff, threatening to call the police, saying we robbed her. Your son Roberto is trying to calm her down, but she slapped him in front of everyone. She slapped him. I felt a pang of pain for my son, but I crushed it quickly. He chose his partner. He chose his silence. And Esteban? I asked, a thread of worry in my voice. The boy is sitting at the head table with his head in his hands. The bride is crying. Zoila, are you sure you want to go through with this? People are hungry. There are already rumors that the catering company went bankrupt in the middle of the wedding. You're making me look bad too, though I understand your point. Ricardo, you have your full payment secured. I transferred the rest yesterday, remember? I said firmly. Don't worry about your reputation. Tomorrow I'll make sure everyone knows Ferrero Catering is impeccable and only followed the orders of the contract owner. Say it was an issue of insufficient authorized funds from the family. That'll confuse them even more. Insufficient funds? But it's paid. Exactly. But they don't know that. Let them think the check bounced. Let them feel the shame of the poverty they despise so much. Ricardo let out a nervous little laugh. You're terrifying, Zoila. I've never seen you like this. Neither have I, Ricardo. Neither have I. I hung up the phone. The satisfaction was short-lived. I knew this was only the beginning. Lorena would come for me. Roberto would come for me. They would show up at my house demanding explanations, screaming, trying to make me feel guilty for ruining the most important day. But I wasn't afraid anymore. I looked at the blue folder. There was my rediscovered power. For years I had believed my only power was unconditional love, the ability to give and forgive. What a terrible mistake. In the world of people like Lorena, love is a weakness to be exploited. The real power, the only language they understand, is property and money. I stood up and went to the bathroom to wash my face. My makeup had smudged slightly, but my eyes shone with a new intensity. I removed the silver brooch, the one Lorena had scorned, and put it away in my jewelry box with reverence. Smells like mothballs and poverty, I murmured, repeating her poisonous words. I went back to the desk and picked up a blank sheet of paper and my fountain pen. I began writing a list. Not a grocery list. Not a recipe list. A list of assets and debts. 1. Cost of the cancelled banquet, in my favor per the partial refund clause for unserved supplies. 2. Overdue mortgage loan on the house on the hill. 3. Seed capital for Roberto's import company, never repaid. 4. The car, registered to the company but paid for by me. The total was astronomical. If I enforced all of it, I would leave them out on the street. Literally. I hadn't just taken away the banquet. I had the power to take away their home, their car, and their business. I shivered. I was capable of going that far. I looked at my hands, working hands, marked with age spots and old oven burn scars. Hands that had stroked Roberto's forehead when he had a fever. Hands that had changed Esteban's diapers. Could those same hands sign an eviction order against their own blood? I remembered the shove, the physical force Lorena had used to drag me out of the garden, the humiliation of being hidden like an old piece of junk. I remembered Roberto's eyes, sliding away toward his glass while his wife mistreated me. Yes, those hands could do it. Because those hands deserved respect. For years I had been meek. I had been sweet grandmother Zoila, always there, never complaining, always quietly reaching for her checkbook. That woman had died the moment the service door of that kitchen closed behind her. The woman sitting at that desk now was Zoila, the businesswoman who had survived economic crises, who had negotiated with tough suppliers, who had built an empire from nothing. And that woman did not negotiate with emotional terrorists. The phone rang again. This time it wasn't Ricardo. It was Roberto's number. I let it ring once, twice, 3 times, until it went to voicemail. Then it rang again. And again. The desperation on the other end was palpable. I imagined the scene, the silent hall, the empty plates, the murmuring guests, Lorena demanding that Roberto fix his mother. I didn't answer. I wasn't going to speak to them over the phone. If they wanted something, they would have to come to my territory. They would have to walk into this house they looked down on for being old and small, and they would have to look me in the eye. I got up and searched my paper address book for a number I hadn't dialed in years. Anselmo's office, I said when they picked up. Yes, I know it's Saturday. Tell him it's Soyla calling. Yes, the caterer. Tell him I need to see him urgently, first thing Monday morning. I have some foreclosure documents I need to dust off. When I hung up, I felt an unusual peace. The plan had begun. This wasn't just about ruining a party anymore. This was about restructuring the entire family hierarchy. This was about teaching them that kindness is not the same thing as stupidity. I walked to the window. The afternoon sun was beginning to set, painting the sky orange and violet. It was a beautiful sunset. I wondered what the wedding guests were eating right now. Probably cold emergency pizza, if they'd managed to find anywhere open for 200 people. I poured myself another glass of wine, sat in my favorite armchair, and turned on the radio. An old bolero filled the room. Everything I have, I owe to you, the lyrics said. The irony made me laugh. A short, dry laugh. Everything they had, they owed to me. And the hour to collect had come. The beggar was about to become the owner of the bank. I waited patiently. I knew it wouldn't take them long to arrive. And when they walked through that door, they would find a wall of reinforced concrete, dressed in silk. The silence in my house was thick, almost solid, like the air before a storm. From my armchair, the empty wine glass resting on the side table, I heard the unmistakable roar of my son's car engine. It wasn't the sound of a calm arrival. It was the screech of tires against asphalt, the sound of uncontainable fury. I glanced at the wall clock, the old pendulum that had marked the rhythm of my life for 40 years. 3:30 in the afternoon. They had taken less time than I expected. Hunger and shame are fast engines, I thought, smoothing a non-existent wrinkle in my silk skirt. I didn't move. I didn't rush to the door the way I used to, with that anxious need to please. I stayed seated, the blue folder resting under my right hand, feeling the rough texture of the cardboard as if it were the hilt of a sword. The front door burst open. They didn't even knock. I heard Lorena's heels striking furiously against the hallway floor, followed by Roberto's heavy, dragging footsteps. Soyla! Lorena's scream echoed off the walls, rattling the glass in the cabinet where I kept my porcelain figures. I know you're here. Show yourself. They appeared in the living room doorway like two ghosts from a nightmare. Lorena, who hours before had looked like a magazine model, was now a portrait of disaster. Her makeup had run from crying or sweating, carving black streaks under her eyes that made her look almost unhinged. The red dress, so tight before, now seemed to be strangling her as her breathing came ragged and violent. Roberto trailed behind, tie loosened, face flushed, a pathetic mix of shame and borrowed rage. I turned my head slowly, without standing. I looked at them with a calm I didn't recognize in myself, a coldness that must have unsettled them, because for a second they froze. Good afternoon, I said. My voice came out soft, polite, in brutal contrast to their hysteria. Lorena took 3 steps forward, her index finger pointed at my face like a bayonet. Good afternoon? You have the nerve to say good afternoon? You just ruined your own grandson's wedding. You humiliated us in front of everyone. People had to go eat at some cheap fast food place because you cancelled the buffet. Roberto stood beside her, trying to adopt an authority that didn't fit him. Mom, you went too far, he said, shaking his head. This is unacceptable. Ferrero told us you gave the order, that you said there were no funds. You made us look like con artists. And aren't you? I asked. The question hung in the air. I didn't wait for an answer. Sit down. You're upset. I am not sitting on your old furniture, Lorena spat. I want an explanation, and I want it now. And you'd better have your checkbook ready, Soila, because you're going to pay for every cent of the moral damage you've caused us. My friends, the people at the club, they all think we're ruined. There it was. The money. Always the money. I stood up slowly. My knees cracked faintly, but my spine stayed straight. I walked to the sideboard and poured myself a bit more wine. I offered you the best I had, I said, deliberately ignoring their empty glasses. I paid for every flower, every plate, every musician. But you, Lorena, made yourself very clear. You said my rags smelled like poverty. You said they'd ruin the aesthetic. I turned to face her. Her eyes burned, but I saw a flicker of doubt when I held her gaze without blinking. I simply followed your instructions, I continued, my voice deadly soft. If my presence smells like poverty, then my money must smell the same way. I didn't want to offend your refined nose with a banquet paid for with an old cook's bills. So I took my poverty with me. Isn't that what you wanted? A little visual cleanup. Lorena gasped for air like a fish out of water. Her face went from red to purple. You're bitter, she shouted. You did this out of spite. Did you know we had no way to pay another vendor at that moment? Exactly, I admitted, taking a sip of wine. I knew you had no money, because whatever money you do have, you spend on appearances, not on reality. Roberto stepped forward, hands in his pockets, that defensive gesture he'd had since childhood, whenever I caught him in a lie. Mom, please. Esteban is devastated. He left with the bride for the hotel. He didn't even want to come. How could you do this to him? He adores you. I felt a stab in my heart at the mention of Esteban, but I forced it down. Esteban was a good boy. But he was also a 25-year-old man who had allowed his mother to push me into a kitchen and said nothing. Silence is complicity too, I said dryly. Esteban will survive. He'll learn that actions have consequences. A lesson the two of you apparently skipped in the school of life. Lorena began pacing the room, touching my things with disdain, as if looking for something to break. This isn't going to end here, she muttered, talking more to herself than to me. I'm going to sue you. I'll say you're senile, that you've lost your mind. Mental incapacity. Roberto, call the lawyer tomorrow. Your mother cannot be allowed to manage her own money if she's going to pull stunts like this. I smiled. A small, almost imperceptible smile. They were falling into the trap with startling ease. They were threatening the only person holding the roof over their heads. Mental incapacity, I repeated, walking back to my chair and picking up the blue folder. Interesting theory, Lorena. Though I think a judge would find my decision to cancel a service, I contracted myself quite lucid. Clause 14 of the contract. I read it this morning. I don't give a damn about the contract. Lorena stopped in front of me, hands on her hips. Listen to me carefully, old woman. You are going to fix this. You are going to transfer us $50,000 right now to cover the cost of the new reception we'll be holding next week, and you are going to publicly apologize. If you don't, I swear you will never see your grandchildren again. The final threat. The card they always played. Emotional blackmail. In another lifetime, that sentence would have made me cry, would have made me reach for my checkbook with trembling hands. But that afternoon, I only felt disgust. A deep, visceral disgust. I looked at Roberto. I hoped he would say something, that he would tell his wife. Enough, you cannot speak to my mother like that. But Roberto was staring at the floor, studying the pattern of the Persian rug as if it were the most fascinating thing in the world. His cowardice hurt more than Lorena's cruelty. $50,000, I asked, pretending to consider the figure. That's a lot of money. It's the bare minimum, Lorena assured me, sensing a crack in my armor. Or so she believed. And I want control of Roberto's company accounts. I know you still have signing authority. I want you to step back completely. You're in the way now, Soila. Your time has passed. It's our turn to enjoy things now. Enjoy, I whispered. Of course. You've worked so hard. I opened the blue folder on my lap. The sound of the paper unfolding was the only noise in the room for a few seconds. I pulled out the notarized document, the debt acknowledgement secured by a mortgage, signed 12 years earlier. The paper had yellowed at the edges, but the black ink of the signatures was still as dark and binding as the day it was written. "Roberto," I said, ignoring Lorena. "Do you remember this paper?" My son looked up, squinting to make out the document from a distance. "What is that?" he asked, tired. "Come closer," I ordered. It was a soft command, but heavy with an authority that made him obey instinctively. He walked over and took the paper. I watched the color drain from his face, leaving him pale as wax. His hands began to shake. "Mom, this is old," he stammered. "This was back when the import company—" "What is it?" Lorena demanded, snatching the paper from his hands. Her eyes scanned the text hungrily, searching for numbers, but landing instead on legal terms. "Mortgage. What does this mean?" "It means," I explained, crossing my legs and settling into the chair like a judge on the bench, "that the house you live in, that beautiful house on the hill with the pool and the garden you show off so much on Instagram, is not yours. It's mine." "That's a lie," Lorena shouted. "We bought that house. We've been paying the bank mortgage for years." "You paid the bank with my money," I corrected, hardening my voice. "I lent you the capital to pay off the bank debt when you were about to lose everything. And you signed this, a guarantee. If you didn't repay me within 7 years, the house would become mine. It's been 12 years, Lorena. 5 years of grace. 5 years in which I haven't received 1 cent, 1 thank you, 1 visit that wasn't to ask for something." Lorena looked at Roberto in horror. "Is this true?" she hissed. "We owe this woman the house?" Roberto nodded, defeated. "It was supposed to be a formality, Lor. Mom said it was just for security. I never thought." "A formality?" I laughed, a dry, joyless laugh. "Yes, Roberto. A formality I've decided to enforce today." I stood and walked to the window. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the garden. I felt powerful, but also infinitely sad. It was the power of the executioner who must carry out the sentence of someone he once loved. "You two came here to demand money from me," I said, my back to them. "You came to insult me in my own house. To call me old. To tell me I'm in the way. You came to threaten to take my grandchildren away from me. Well, I've heard enough." I turned to face them. Lorena was still holding the paper as if it burned her hands. She wasn't screaming anymore. Fear had begun seeping into her rage, cooling it. "You have 2 options," I said, raising 2 fingers. "Option 1. You leave my house right now. You apologize publicly for treating me like a dog. And you accept that starting today, the rules change. No more checks. No more gifts. No more indulgences." "And option 2? Roberto asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Option 2, I said, walking toward the landline and picking up the receiver, "is that I call my lawyer Mr. Anselmo. He already has the foreclosure lawsuit drafted. If I make that call, by Monday morning you'll have an eviction order at your door. And you won't just lose the house. I'll go after the company too, Roberto. I'll go after the car. I'll go after everything I paid for that you believe belongs to you by divine right." Silence fell over the room again, but this time it was different. It wasn't the silence of waiting. It was the silence of terror. Lorena looked at the paper, then at me, then at her designer shoes, which I had probably paid for indirectly too. She was calculating. I could see the gears of her scheming mind spinning at full speed. She knew she had lost, but her pride wouldn't let her bend the knee. "You wouldn't dare," she whispered, trying to recover some of her venom. "Leave your own son on the street? Your own grandson? You're a mother, Soila. Mothers don't do that. Mothers raise children, not parasites," I answered with a coldness that chilled even me. "And grandmothers indulge, but they don't let themselves be trampled. You underestimated me, Lorena. You thought that because I'm old and I like to cook, I was stupid. You thought my love was weakness. I took a step toward her, invading her personal space for the first time. She instinctively stepped back, bumping into the edge of the table. Look at me, I demanded. Look at me carefully. I am not the little old woman in the dark corner. I am the owner of everything around you. And I am tired. Very tired. Roberto covered his face with his hands. I heard a muffled sob. Mom, please, don't do this to us. I'm not doing anything to you, I replied. You did this to yourselves the moment you decided I was worth less than a perfect photograph. The phone in my hand began to give the dial tone. I hung it up slowly. You have until tomorrow at noon to decide, I said. Now go. I want to eat my dinner in peace. And please close the door on your way out. I don't want the warmth to escape my home. And I don't want the smell of your hypocrisy coming in. Lorena dropped the paper onto the table as if it were toxic. She looked at me with pure, distilled hatred, but she said nothing. She knew that one more word could cost her the entire lifestyle she had left. She grabbed Roberto's arm and pulled him toward the door. Let's go, she said, her voice trembling. This isn't over. You're wrong, I answered as they walked down the hallway. This is only just beginning. I heard the door close. This time, there was no slam. Just a soft, almost fearful click. I was alone in the living room again. My legs, which had held firm through the confrontation, suddenly gave out. I sank into the armchair, releasing a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I looked at the document on the table, picked it up, and put it back in the blue folder. My hands weren't shaking. I felt a strange mental clarity. For years I had lived with a blindfold over my eyes, justifying the unjustifiable. That day, the blindfold had finally fallen. I made myself a cup of chamomile tea and looked out the kitchen window at the darkening garden. I knew Lorena wouldn't surrender easily. She would try to manipulate Esteban. She would try to turn the family against me. But she didn't know I had more cards to play. She didn't know I kept copies of bank statements, of abusive emails, of every small betrayal. That night I slept like I hadn't slept in years, without the anxiety of whether they'd like a gift, whether they'd call, whether I was enough. I knew the war would be long and dirty, but for the first time in my life, I wasn't fighting for their love. I was fighting for my dignity, and that was a battle I did not intend to lose. Monday morning arrived under a sky of heavy grey lead, as if the atmosphere itself knew that irreversible sentences would be handed down that day. I hadn't slept much, but I didn't feel tired either. A strange electricity ran through my body, the same nervous energy I used to feel years ago before closing a big contract for my catering business. I got up before dawn, showered with cold water to sharpen my senses, and dressed in my best tailored suit, a sober, impeccable navy blue set. There was no room for festive silks or champagne colors anymore. That day I wasn't a grandmother. I was a creditor. At 8 o'clock sharp, the doorbell rang with the British punctuality that characterized Don Anselmo. My lawyer, a 70-year-old man with skin weathered like the leather of his briefcase and eyes that had seen too much human misery, walked in with a slight nod of greeting. We didn't need many words. He knew what was at stake. He spread the documents across the mahogany dining table, lining them up with surgical precision. Are you sure about this, Soyla? He asked, looking at me over his reading glasses. Once you sign the foreclosure notice and the civil complaint, there's no turning back. The legal machinery is slow to start, but impossible to stop. I've never been more certain, Anselmo, I answered, pouring him a cup of black coffee. Doubt is a luxury I can no longer afford. They're on their way. I told them 9 o'clock. They're bringing the boy, he warned, looking out the window. Your son's car just parked. I see Esteban getting out. I felt my stomach drop, a sudden wave of nausea. I knew they would use my grandson. Lorena was predictable in her cruelty. I knew Esteban was my Achilles heel, the only crack in my armor where she could try to bleed me dry. I took a deep breath, holding back the tears that wanted to fall at the betrayal of seeing my boy used as a human shield. "Let them in," I said, hardening my jaw. "Let all of them in." When the door opened, the air in the room changed. Lorena walked in first, head held high, an arrogant smile that never reached her eyes. She wore enormous sunglasses, probably to hide the damage of a weekend spent in fury. Behind her came Roberto, head down, dragging his feet like a man walking to his execution. And at the back, Esteban. My grandson looked at me and I felt my heart split in two. His eyes were red, swollen. He didn't greet me. He stood by the doorframe, arms crossed, radiating a mix of pain and resentment that hit me harder than any insult his mother could have thrown. "Here we are, Soyla," Lorena said, pulling off her sunglasses in a theatrical gesture and tossing them onto the sofa. "And we brought Esteban, so you'll have the decency to explain to his face why you decided to ruin the most important day of his life. Go ahead. Tell him it was some senile old woman's whim." Roberto tried to intervene, placing a hand on his wife's shoulder. "Lorena, please, don't start like this." "Be quiet, Roberto," she snapped. "Your mother declared war on us. So here are her soldiers." I stood by the head of the table, Anselmo silent at my right, a quiet guardian. I didn't look at Lorena. My eyes locked onto Esteban. "Sit down, son," I said gently. "I don't want to sit, Grandma," he answered, his voice breaking. "I just want to know why. Why did you do that to us? My friends, my wife's family, everyone thinks we're crazy or bankrupt. It was a horrifying humiliation. Mom says you lost your mind, that you cancelled the buffet because you didn't like your seat. Is that true?" "Over a seat, Grandma." Lorena's manipulation had been masterful. She had reduced my trampled dignity to a simple tantrum over a chair. "It wasn't about a seat, Esteban," I said, keeping my voice steady even as I trembled inside. "And it wasn't a whim either." "Of course it was," Lorena shouted, advancing toward the table. "Look at her, Esteban, standing there with her lawyer. She wants to take our house. She wants to leave us on the street. Can you believe it? Your own grandmother." Esteban's eyes went wide and he looked at Roberto. "Dad, what is she talking about?" Roberto didn't answer. He sank into a chair, covering his face with his hands. My son's silence was the first crack in Lorena's story. "Sit down," I ordered again, and this time my voice carried such authority that even Lorena stepped back and dropped into a chair. Esteban, confused, sat across from me. I gave Anselmo a signal. The lawyer opened his briefcase and pulled out 3 thick folders. The sound of the paper sliding across the polished wood was the only noise in the room for a few eternal seconds. "Esteban," I began, deliberately ignoring his parents. "You're an intelligent man. You just got married. You're going to build your own family, and to build a real future, you need real foundations. Not lies." "What lies are you talking about?" he asked, distrustful. "All the ones that have propped up your parents' lifestyle for the last 15 years, I answered. I took the first folder and slid it gently to the center of the table. It fell open, revealing bank statements, copies of checks, wire transfers. "Your mother told you I cancelled the buffet because I was offended about my seat. The truth is, your mother, minutes before the ceremony, dragged me into a corner. She told me my silk dress, the one I bought with so much effort, smelled like poverty and mothballs, and she forced me to hide in the service kitchen. She told me my rags would ruin your photos." Esteban went pale. He looked at his mother. "Mom, did you do that?" "I did it for you." Lorena defended herself, shrieking. That woman looked ridiculous. She was going to be in the official video. "I just asked her to be discreet." "You told me to go to the kitchen," I cut in coldly, "because that's where I come from." "And you were right, Lorena. I do come from the kitchen." And as the owner of that kitchen and the sole payer of the banquet, I decided that if my presence was an embarrassment, my money should be too. "But you ruined my wedding," Esteban insisted, though his tone was no longer accusatory, just pain. "No, son. Your mother ruined your wedding, the moment she chose Instagram aesthetics over your grandmother's dignity. I simply withdrew my funding." Lorena slammed her fist on the table. "Enough with the sad stories," she barked. "We came here to fix this. Tell this lawyer to tear up those papers, or I swear." "Or what, Lorena?" I interrupted, rising slowly. "What else are you going to take from me? My greeting? My visits? There's nothing left for you to take, dear. But you too, you have a great deal left to lose." Anselmo pushed the second folder toward Roberto. "Mr. Roberto," the lawyer said in his raspy voice, "this is the notarial demand for immediate payment of the debt incurred 12 years ago, plus accrued default interest. The total amount comes to $40,000. Roberto lifted his head, pale as a corpse. "We don't have that money, Anselmo, you know that." "I know," the lawyer said. "Which is why, in accordance with Clause 5 of the debt acknowledgement contract that you and your wife signed freely, my client, Mrs. Soyla, has decided to enforce the guarantee." "What guarantee?" Esteban asked, staring at the papers in horror. "The house, Esteban," I said. "The house on the hill where you grew up. The house your parents claim is theirs. It never was. I paid off the mortgage when the bank was about to foreclose on them. They signed a paper saying that if they didn't repay me, the house would revert to me. They never repaid a single cent." Lorena shot to her feet, eyes bulging, looking like a cornered animal. "This is a trap," she screamed, pointing at me. "You tricked us. You said it was to help us. And I did help you," I answered, unmoved. "You lived 12 years for free in a mansion. 12 years of trips, new cars, designer clothes, all financed because you never had to pay a mortgage or rent. You lived like the rich on the money of this old cook. But the party's over, Lorena. You can't kick us out," she wailed. "It's our home, Esteban. Say something to her. It's the house you grew up in." Esteban picked up the documents. His hands trembled as he read the figures, the dates, his parents' signatures. I watched reality settle into his mind. The image of his successful parents crumbled before his eyes, revealing two irresponsible people who had abused their mother's kindness for over a decade. "Dad," Esteban murmured. "Is this true? Do you owe Grandma all this money?" Roberto nodded, unable to lie in the face of documented evidence. "Yes," he said. "It's true. And that's not all," I added, sliding across the third and final folder. It was the finishing blow, the last bomb I had saved. "Anselmo, explain the situation with Roberto's import company." Anselmo adjusted his glasses and read in a flat, monotone voice. "Mrs. Soyla owns 51% of the company's shares, having provided the initial capital and the cash injections during the 2015 and 2019 crises. As majority shareholder, she has called an extraordinary meeting for this morning at 11. The only item on the agenda is the removal of the current general manager, Mr. Roberto, and the dissolution and liquidation of the company's assets." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of the end of the world. Roberto looked at me, and for the first time I saw real fear in his eyes. Not fear of losing money. Fear of losing his identity. Without the house and without the company, Roberto was nothing. "Mom," he whispered, "the company is my life." "No, Roberto," I corrected him with sadness. "The company was my investment. You just played at being the boss, and you've been a poor manager. You diverted corporate funds to pay for your wife's luxuries. I have the audits right here. I could sue you for fraudulent management and send you to prison. But I won't, because you're still my son. I'm only going to shut the company down. The game is over." Lorena sank back into her chair, completely defeated. Her face, once full of fury, was now a mask of disbelief. She realized she had pushed too hard, and the wall had come crashing down on her. She had woken a sleeping giant. "Esteban," I said, turning my attention back to my grandson, who was staring at the table as if watching a car crash. I'm sorry you had to find out this way, but I will not keep letting them live off my blood while they spit in my face. Esteban stood slowly, looked at his mother, then his father. There was disappointment in his eyes, a deep, painful disappointment, the kind that changes people forever. You told me Grandma was crazy, Mom, Esteban said, his voice hoarse. You told me she hated us. But it turns out you've been robbing her for years. It's not robbery, it's family, Lorena tried to justify, but her voice was a thin thread now. No, Esteban cut her off. Family is what Grandma did for us. This is parasitism. He turned to me. His eyes filled with tears, but this time they were tears of his own shame. He walked over and took my hands, those old spotted hands that Lorena had despised. Forgive me, Grandma, he said, his voice breaking. Forgive me for not looking for you in that kitchen. Forgive me for believing their lies. I'm an idiot. You are not an idiot, my love, I said, stroking his cheek, feeling as though I had finally recovered something I had lost. You're just young, and you trusted your parents. That's natural. I looked at Roberto and Lorena. They were destroyed. The arrogance had evaporated, leaving only the raw reality of their failure. You have 30 days to vacate the house, Anselmo announced, closing his briefcase with a definitive click. It's a generous timeline, considering the circumstances. The official notice will arrive tomorrow. I suggest you start packing. Lorena looked up. Her mascara had run all over her face. She looked like a sad clown. Where are we supposed to go? She asked, and for the first time in years her voice sounded human. Frightened. To work, Lorena, I answered, looking her straight in the eyes. You're going to go work, the way I did at 20, at 30, at 40, and at 70. Maybe then you'll learn that money doesn't smell like poverty or mothballs. Money smells like sweat. And sweat has dignity. Roberto rose unsteadily. He tried to approach me, maybe to beg for mercy, but Esteban stepped between us. Let's go, Dad, Esteban said firmly. You've done enough damage for one day. He turned to me. I'll call you later, Grandma. I'll come alone. Without them. I nodded. Watching my grandson take control, watching him detach from his parents' toxicity, was my greatest victory. I didn't need the house. I didn't need the company. I needed to know I hadn't lost my grandson. They walked out of my house in silence. No more slammed doors, no more screaming, no more threats. Just the sound of defeated footsteps dragging toward the exit. When the door closed behind them, I felt the weight of 1,000 tons lift off my shoulders. Anselmo took off his glasses and cleaned them with a handkerchief. That was brutal, Soyla, he said, but necessary. Like surgery, Anselmo, I said, walking to the window to watch the car pull away. You have to cut out the infected flesh to save the body. I stood there watching the vehicle disappear around the curve. My soul ached. No mother wants to see her son fall. But as I watched the sun try to break through the grey clouds, I knew I had done the right thing. I had reclaimed my life. I had reclaimed my respect. And most importantly, I had taught a lesson worth more than any wedding banquet. The old woman in rags had just proven that the fabric of her dignity was unbreakable. The days that followed that fateful Monday in my dining room were not easy, but they had a quality I hadn't felt in decades. Truth. The air in my house, once heavy with other people's expectations and bought silences, grew light, almost transparent. I kept my word, and Anselmo did his duty. There was no turning back. The legal machinery, once set in motion, crushed my son and daughter-in-law's fantasies of grandeur with the indifference of a steamroller. The eviction from the house on the hill happened exactly 30 days after our confrontation. I wasn't there while they carried out their furniture. I didn't have the stomach to watch Roberto haul boxes with his back bent in shame, or to hear Lorena's last hysterical curses screamed at my name. Still, I went the next day. I needed to. I needed to see with my own eyes that the temple of lies had been left empty. When I walked into that mansion, my footsteps echoed across the deserted marble floor. The walls, once covered in pretentious paintings and gilded mirrors, now showed pale rectangles where the sun had never reached, scars of a decoration they could never truly afford. I walked through the rooms. Lorena's closet, once overflowing with designer shoes and bags, was bare. Only a wire hanger lay on the floor and a stale smell of expensive perfume mixed with dust. In the kitchen of that house, a magazine kitchen Lorena had never used for anything more complicated than making coffee, I found a note stuck to the granite island. It was from my son. It simply said, "Goodbye, Mom. I hope you're happy with your victory." I tore the paper off and crumpled it in my fist. No, I wasn't happy. No mother celebrates her son's downfall. But I felt a deep, unshakable peace. It wasn't a victory over them. It was a victory over my own blindness. I had stopped funding their self-destruction. I had shut off the tap that fed their arrogance. The sale of the property was quick. The real estate market was hungry, and the location was prime. With the proceeds, I paid off the outstanding debts of Roberto's company before dissolving it for good. I didn't want my name stained by fraudulent bankruptcy. I paid the vendors, gave fair severance to the few loyal employees who remained, and closed the doors of Roberto Imports forever. It was like amputating a gangrenous limb, painful at first, but necessary for the rest of the body to survive. The social consequences for Lorena were devastating, just as she had feared. In her plastic world, poverty is the one unforgivable leprosy. When word got out that they had lost the house and the business, and rumors travel fast when you have friends like hers, Lorena's phone stopped ringing. The club invitations dried up. The same women who used to pose with her in Instagram photos blocked her without mercy. She discovered in the hardest way possible that no one had ever loved her. They loved her status, her access, her appearance. Without the stage I had been paying for, the actress no longer had an audience. I heard, through an old acquaintance, that they moved into a 2-bedroom apartment in a working-class part of the city. A decent place, but a world away from the luxury they had been spoiled by. Roberto found work as a sales manager at an auto parts company. A real job, with a schedule, with a boss who wasn't his mother and who demanded results. Lorena, for her part, had to step down from her stiletto heels. The last I heard, she was working the front desk of an aesthetics clinic, forcing smiles for clients who could actually afford the treatments she no longer could. Life, with its master irony, had put her in service to the very people she used to try to impress. But the real transformation didn't happen to them. It happened to Esteban, and to me. My grandson kept his word. He distanced himself from his parents' toxicity with a maturity that surprised me. His marriage, born under the shadow of that scandal, survived, miraculously. Maybe because his wife, a young woman named Camila, turned out to be far more sensible than I ever expected. She too had grown tired of Lorena's pretensions. Together they rented a small studio apartment and started from zero. Esteban came to see me 2 weeks after the eviction. I was in my garden, pruning the roses, when I saw him arrive. He didn't drive the sports car his father used to lend him. He walked from the bus stop. "Grandma," he said, standing on the other side of the gate. I took off my gardening gloves and let him in. We hugged in silence. It was a long embrace, one where every apology words could never fully cover was somehow said anyway. "I quit the job my dad got me," he told me as we drank lemonade on the porch. "It was a ghost position, Grandma. I did nothing and collected a salary. It made me sick with shame. Now I'm working at a restaurant, in the back office. I'm learning how real costs work, real inventory, the real business." I smiled. The seed had fallen on fertile ground after all. "That makes me happy, son. Honest work is the only pillow you can sleep peacefully on." "I want to ask you something," he said, looking down at his hands. "I don't want money. I don't want loans. But I want to know, someday, could you teach me your recipes? The real ones. The ones you use to build your business." I felt a warm emotion rise in my chest. Recipes aren't state secrets, Esteban. Of course I'll teach you. But on one condition. You chop the onions. He laughed, a clean, young laugh. Deal. From that day on, my Sundays came back to life. Esteban and Camila would come for lunch, and my kitchen, once lonely, filled again with steam, the smell of spices, and laughter. I taught them my famous empanadas, my slow-roasted meats, the desserts that had once paid for their father's education. I got my grandson back, not with checks, but with flour and time. With the money recovered from the foreclosure and the sale of the assets, I did something I should have done 20 years earlier. I went to a travel agency and bought a plane ticket. First class. Destination: Italy. I had always dreamed of touring Tuscany, of eating handmade pasta in tiny stone villages, of watching the sunset over the vineyards. But I had always postponed it. First it was Roberto's university, I would say. Then the children's house. Then the wedding. There was always a first, that was never me. That postponed woman died the day they locked me in that kitchen. The new soiler didn't ask permission. The trip was a revelation. I walked the streets of Florence in my comfortable shoes. I ate gelato without guilt and toasted with strangers in a language I barely stumbled through. I felt alive. I felt like a woman, not just a mother or a grandmother. I realized life doesn't end at 70. It ends the moment you stop respecting yourself. In a small boutique in Rome, I saw a dress. Deep blue silk, elegant, with a perfect drape. I walked in and tried it on. I looked at myself in the fitting room mirror. The silk didn't hide my wrinkles or the softness of my arms, but it caught the light in my eyes and the firmness of my posture. Bellissima, the saleswoman said. Yes, I answered in my own language, smiling at my reflection. It smells like freedom. I bought it. Not for a wedding, not to impress anyone. I bought it to have dinner alone that night at the best restaurant in the city, celebrating my own company. When I came home, I found the house exactly as I'd left it. Small, warm, mine. I no longer felt the need to fill it with the presence of people who didn't value me. The solitude that used to frighten me had become a luxurious companion, full of books, music, and memories of my trip. Roberto called me a few months ago. It was a short, tense call. He told me Lorena had left him. Without money and without status, it seemed the love of his life hadn't survived the test of reality. He was living alone in a studio apartment, depressed. He asked me for money, just a little, to start over. I took a deep breath. The old soiler would have run straight to the bank. The old soiler would have thought, poor thing, he's alone, it's my duty. But I looked at my hands, the hands that had worked so hard, the hands that had signed the papers of my own liberation, and I knew that helping him would only sink him deeper. No, Roberto, I told him calmly. I'm not going to give you money. You have your health, you have a job, and you have 2 hands. Use them. If you want to come for a Sunday meal, my door is open. There will be hot food. But the checkbook is closed forever. He hung up without saying goodbye. It hurt. Of course it hurt. But the pain of watching a son finally grow up at 50 years old is a necessary pain. Maybe now, without a safety net, he would finally learn to walk. And if he didn't, well, that was no longer my burden to carry. Today, as I write this sitting at my oak desk, with a glass of the Chianti I brought back from my trip, an old bolero playing softly on the radio, I look back and I don't see ruins. I see foundations. I had to tear down a false building to find the solid ground underneath it. My champagne silk dress, the one that started the war, still hangs in my closet. I had it cleaned and covered it with a new garment bag. I don't wear it anymore. I don't need to. It has become something more than a piece of clothing. It is my flag. My reminder. My trophy of war. Every time I open that closet and see the pearly shine of that fabric, I remember the exact moment I decided that no one, absolutely no one, has the right to hide me in a kitchen. To the women my age, to the ones who have given everything, who have taken the bread from their own mouths to feed ungrateful children, to the ones who are afraid of becoming a burden or an embarrassment, I say this to you. You are not invisible. Your history, your wrinkles, your worn hands, they are the map of a treasure no one has the right to despise. Do not let them corner you. Do not let them tell you your time has passed, or that your tastes smell like mothballs. Respect is not requested. It is imposed. And sometimes, to finally be seen, you have to be willing to disappear, and take your light with you. I paid a high price for my dignity. I lost the illusion of a perfect family. I lost the daily closeness with my son. But I got something far more valuable in return. I got myself back. And believe me, my friends, there is no loneliness sadder than being surrounded by people who make you feel alone, and no company sweeter than the peace you have earned with your own 2 hands. Life is a banquet, and I have decided that I will never again sit at a table where I am not served with respect. Because at the end of the day, dignity is the one dress that never goes out of style, and the only luxury we take with us to the grave.